Okay, well, so we are in Amos chapter 9. I told you that there was some light at the end of the tunnel. Jan made sure she let me know that there wasn't much light at the end of the tunnel, way at the end.
I started reading, I'm like, is he not the one?
And that's true. Amos does not just suddenly do 180-degree swivel from judgment and brimstone and fire to all is well. But there is a little bit of hope in Amos. And interestingly, the early church saw it that way too. And we'll talk about that as we get to the end of chapter 9. So Amos 9, as Jen articulately pointed out, it continues with more of the same as we open the chapter. There's this vision that Amos has of God standing by the altar in the temple, and he said, "Strike the tops of the pillars, the threshold shake, bring them down on the heads of all the people. Those who are left, I'll kill with the sword. No one will get away, none will escape." And then there's this very poetic picture. Though they dig down to the depths below, from there my hand will take them. Though they climb up to the heavens above, from there I'll bring them down. The point is, in all this, wherever they might hide, when God's judgment comes, wherever people might try to escape from it, get away from it, God will find them and bring them to this judgment. Whether it's the top of Carmel, the highest place anybody could think of in the promised land, or whether it's down in the depths of the sea. God has a sea monster down there who might have. Though they're driven into exile by their enemies, there I'll command the sword to slay them. And then this line that is kind of chilling if you think about it: I will keep my eye on them for harm and not for good. Not not what we want from God, not what we expect from God, right? We tend to think that God watches over his people, that God cares for his people. And Amos is assuming that too, because, and so that's why this is such a chilling statement that God makes, because it's a reversal. It's a total 180 from what you expect, from what you see all through the Old Testament, from the Psalms, from the stories of God being with his people. What you expect is that God sees his people's struggles and sees them when they're in trouble, and sees them when they're in danger, and reaches out to save them. And here Amos is sort of turning that on its head. God is going to keep his eye on them instead for harm and not for good. So verse 5, then the Lord Almighty, he touches the earth and it melts, and all who live in it mourn. The whole land rises like the Nile, then sinks like the river of Egypt. He builds his lofty palace in the heavens and sets its foundation on the earth. He calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. So it's this picture of God who's powerful, all powerful, and when he acts, it has cosmic circumstances, right? It has these cataclysmic effects when God acts. There's earthquake, and there's the earth melts, and God's palace is pictured as being in the heavens while its foundation is all the way there. So God rules over all creation. Heavens and the earth in the Old Testament always has to do, it's all of creation. Sometimes we think of heaven as, that's where God lives, and the earth is where we live. And the Old Testament view of the world, of the universe, is there's the heavens and there's the earth. And so God's throne, God's palace takes up all of the creation. So that's kind of how we start in Amos 9. More of the same, as we said. Anything you notice here that you want to talk about? Anything that stands out to you that you think we ought to comment on or talk more about?
Well, for whatever reason, when I read 9:1, just the pretty much just the first paragraph. It was like strike down the temple columns, and the foundation will shake and bring down the roof on the people. I don't know why, but that reminded me of Samson.
Yeah, well, that's what Samson did with the pillars in the Philistine temple, right? I mean, that's an
Yeah.
interesting comparison, right? God, again, bringing judgment and bringing it at the place where the Philistines were assembled to worship their God. Yeah, you're right. That's an interesting sort of comparison and picture there. This time, of course, it seems like it's God who's striking the pillars and causing
Right.
the collapse. And it's, I mean, it's tough language. I mean, it's this destruction, this slaughter of all these people who are gathered for worship, seemingly. Now, we know from Amos that their worship hasn't really permeated their lives and doesn't really have to do with how they treat one another, but and that their worship even can be at times idolatrous. But yeah, I mean, the people gathered in the temple is this really kind of dramatic picture of people gathered in the temple and the temple collapsing on them because God has determined to bring about judgment.
Interestingly, he sees the Lord standing by the altar. Is it, they talked about the altar at Bethel, or we're not told exactly where,
Right.
but he evidently recognizes the place.
Right. Whether it's the altar of the main worship center in Bethel or that's probably it, I would guess, but certainly it's again, the Israelites are in view here, the northern kingdom. And the point of all those couplets there in verses 2 through 4 is nobody escapes, nobody gets away. Everybody is going to face this judgment that God's about to bring on. And it's a dramatic judgment. Yeah, really good point, Linda. Thank you. What else? What else you guys notice here? Anything else you want to bring up? If you're worried about the slaughter, because I mean, I think some of this is supposed to be poetic. We know that when the Assyrians came, not everybody was killed. We know that not literally everyone was massacred by the Assyrians, but it is the end for the northern kingdom, and that's maybe what's in view here. It's not so much, the point isn't so much the slaughter, the massacre. The point is nobody is going to escape this judgment that's coming. The whole nation is going to suffer in this judgment that's coming. I struggle with when people see God's judgment in natural disasters. I really struggle with, I don't want to attribute to God what I don't know is attributable to God. I don't want to, I don't want to say that, well, so-and-so deserved that judgment, so-and-so deserved that judgment, as sometimes people who believe in God and believe in his sovereignty rightly have been known to do. I think we have to be really careful about that. And this illustrates why we have to be careful about that, because this is not easy language. This is very difficult, and very harsh, and it's very hard for us to read.
But it's not going to be God himself who does these things. I mean, directly, he's going to use what the Assyrians.
The Assyrians, we know, is
to conquer
Right.
the kingdom and kill a lot of people, but take some into into exile maybe. And, you know, we know from many other occasions that if God didn't want that to happen, even though, you know, however powerful the Assyrians might be, if God didn't want this to happen,
Right.
it wouldn't happen.
Right.
He wouldn't allow it to happen, just like I think the effects of a natural disaster. Again, I think we know that God is powerful enough to stop it or change its direction so that it doesn't, you know, affect people. So it's just God allowing natural forces, or in this case, a foreign army to, I guess, bring his judgment
Yeah, right.
upon the people. It's not, he's not doing it himself, he's allowing this to happen because of their sinfulness.
And we know because of Amos that this is because of God's judgment. We don't always know that. We don't always have that explanation.
Yeah,
you
and
know.
I'm not saying that we can always attribute a natural disaster, you know, hurting a lot of people, that's not God's judgment on them necessarily. So, that isn't what I meant to
Right,
say.
I understand. Yeah, and in this case, you know, we in this case, that's exactly right. That's exactly what God does. Habakkuk later, with the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin will actually, his book is all about him questioning God, asking, you know, how could you do this? How could you, you know, first of all, he says, you know, how could you let your people get away with all this stuff? And God says, well, I'm not going to let them get away with this stuff. I'm about to send the Babylonians to take care of that. And then Habakkuk says, well, wait, you can't do that. They're worse than we are, you know. So yeah, we're always trying to sort of figure these things out. Always would like to sort of have insight into God's mind as to why he does things or allows things, why we can't always figure that out. We don't always know the answers to those questions. And our task as God's people is to continue to trust in him and believe in his promises to us in Jesus, and to continue on in faithfulness and in love for our neighbors when something happens. And we know that's what we've been given, and why God lets a pandemic affect the whole world as this has. I can't ask you that. I can't answer that. I can tell you that there have been many times through the ages that Christians have wondered exactly that. What's this about? And have tried all sorts of explanations as to why God is doing this or why God allowed this. And the bottom line, I don't, you know, short of a prophet telling us, I don't know that we can ever understand everything exactly. In fact, I know we can't.
I think there's a difference, especially as you're talking about natural disasters. There's a difference between what God allows to happen and what God does intentionally to you that's there. And, you know, good things or bad things do happen to good people that's there through the laws of nature and things that are allowed. And, you know, if God put a shell around us where nothing ever bad happened to we who followed Christ, you know, our nature of that would be, you know, we would appreciate it, and a bunch of people would come to Christ for the wrong reason because they're looking for protection. But I think we as humans, once we realize that we have that protection, we would take advantage of it and, you know, forget about it and start, tempting God and et cetera, et cetera. And I think it would go down, you know, a cycle that would not be good for us. It would not be good for God in his relationship to us. And so I don't understand all of that, but I can certainly see why he wouldn't just put a bubble of a shell around us, because I don't think it would be healthy for us in the end.
Yeah, and one of the things we know in Christ is that it's in suffering very often that there is growth, and there is hope, and there's faith, and it's often in suffering that we discover a lot about our relationship with God and about our relationship with one another, and we miss that, without, short of these kinds of things. So, yeah, I mean, that's our calling as we follow Jesus, to suffer the way Jesus. That's with faith and with hope, with love for those around him. That's how we move forward as believers.
Right, because I think what God looks from us is very similar to, when they were about to throw him in the fiery furnace, where they said, my God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we will not worship you. And I think that's the faith that he's looking for from us. I think he still wants us to pray for protection, or pray for healing, or pray for, don't let this storm, happen, or whatever. But even if it does, I'm still going to be faithful, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
And I think the thing that stands out to me when we talk about God's judgment, and what typically hits me is that he tells us the purpose, but I think the bottom line is that of a remnant, or the bottom line is that of him dividing those who want to follow him and those that don't. I think about when they were following him and he turned around and he said, well, do you want to leave too? He asked his disciples. So this judgment that he brings on us because of sin or catastrophe or whatever the case is, it's a pruning. I don't know. I always see it as a pruning. And even when he disciplines me, it's a pruning for me to get rid of those things that are not pleasing to him, and grow in the areas that would be pleasing to him. And that's what I see that he's doing here in Amos. Yeah, that's what I think about judgment or punishment or disciplining. It's for the better, it's for the good of, it's for pulling out what would really represent this goodness that God wants us to be a part of. And I think that's why parents discipline their kids, or accountability is held in jobs. All of those things is, if it's done properly and right, and of course that's how God does it. If it's done right, it's to bring a better end result, a better outcome, and it's not just punitive.
I think that's a really good point. And isn't that a better way to look at suffering? Look at than trying to explain it away, or trying to point your fingers at somebody else. I mean, isn't that a much more positive way to address and to deal with the suffering in your life? To look, what am I learning? How am I growing? What's being, as you say it, what's being pruned away? How can I grow through this process that I'm going through right now, whatever it might be? How can I grow in faith and grow in my walk with Jesus? So verse 7, are you Israelites are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker? It's an interesting point here, right? God says, I can name a couple other nations that I did with whom I did what I did with you. I brought them from one land to another land. So he's saying to the Israelites, in essence, this is got to be hard to hear for God's covenant people, right? You're not so special. You're not as special as you think you are. You're not so out of the ordinary that you are exempt from judgment. And that's the point. It's not that God is denying the covenant he has with his people. There are ways the Israelites are not like the Arameans or the Philistines or the Cushites, right? Principally, God has made this covenant with me. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. But in the instance that they've broken this covenant, now God says, you're not. You think you're exempt from judgment because you're my people? You're not. Peter will say in the New Testament, let judgment begin with the house of God, right? Let judgment start with us. Let that be, our first concern, that we look to ourselves, and we take God's judgment to heart as his people. There's a difference between being called and loved by God versus being privileged over others. And that's kind of the difference we have going here. God's people were called and loved by him, but that doesn't mean they're so privileged as to avoid the judgment that God's about to bring. Surely the eyes of the sovereign Lord are on the sinful kingdom. I will destroy it from the face of the earth. So, yeah. But then there is, I mentioned the remnant. Yet I will not totally destroy the descendants of Jacob, declares the Lord. For I will give the command, and I will shake the people of Israel among all the nations. Now, again, we have at the beginning of this chapter, they're all going to be slaughtered, right? Except that's poetic. What you have here is God saying, but we're gonna sift them. We're gonna shake them out among all the nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve. The exile will be the sieve for Israel, and they will go through this process, and it'll be tough, but we'll winnow out those who sift out those who are righteous. God's going to distinguish eventually between the righteous and the sinners. All the sinners among my people will die by the sword. All those who say disaster will not overtake us. So there is this remnant, and you see that in all the prophets, really almost all the prophets. You see this idea that even after judgment, God will preserve a remnant of his people. And it might not be a big one, and it might be kind of tattered and torn, but God will preserve something of his people. He's not going to totally eliminate them, totally destroy them.
Do you think that it actually would happen like this, where he says, all the sinners among my people will die by the sword? It's almost implying that the ones that are left are going to be all of us are sinners, and I'm sure, it was really the same with them, because nobody could keep the law perfectly. So is he implying there's going to be some sort of a judgment that God will preserve the ones most deserving of life? And then I just, that doesn't seem.
I think I get what I think the remnant kind of terminology is talking about is we're not going to go to zero. We're not going to go to, we're not going to cut everybody off at ground level and that be that. I'm going to preserve one of the ways he preserved his people in captivity in Babylon we know about. Think about Daniel, and Steve, you mentioned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the younger people, right, who were brought into captivity and found in that somehow this conviction to be true to their identity as God's people and to figure out what that looks like when they're in Babylon. The older generation is saying, how can we sing the songs of Zion in a strange land? And Daniel and his friends are saying, well, we're figuring it out. We're going to figure out how to be God's people in this place, far away from the temple and far away from the promised land. So maybe that's one of the ways around it. You just wait till you get to the next generation and use them. That's certainly a possibility. But I think always there's this picture that God leaves us of, as bad as it might get, there are still people who are my people and who haven't forgotten and haven't lost sight of that. Elijah's, bad day in the cave where he's, I'm the only one left, and God is my said, so you're not even close to the only one left. There's a lot left.
Patrick,
Yes, ma'am.
I think that God would spare those that are true believers?
Well, I think often I think certainly as Christians, we believe that God cares for his people. Now, there have been a lot of true believers through the centuries who have died for their faith, right? They've gone to, they've gone to their death because of their faith, not just in spite of it, not because of anything they've done wrong. They've gone to their death because they were believers. So, I mean, how does a remnant work? I don't know always. I don't know why some are spared and some aren't. And I don't think we can sort of draw any hard and fast lines and say these are the rules. I think we just trust this promise that God isn't going to totally forget his people. And even the Northern Kingdom that we don't really know much about beyond this, right? I mean, we know bits and pieces about them. We know a few people in the New Testament that we know of some kind of remnant, but we don't know how that looked or how that worked or what happened. I mean, they never returned to the promised land in any organized fashion the way that the Southern Kingdom did later. So we don't know what that looked like exactly, but we trust this promise of Amos that I'm gonna sift them out, and that's what this as they go away into exile and all in these other places. This is the sift. This is gonna separate the good grain from the pebbles and the sticks and the rocks, and it's interesting. Not a pebble will reach the ground. One of the theologies of the Old Testament is that God plants his people in the promised land. And we're actually going to see that, I think, at the end of Amos here. So the picture is, the pebbles don't hit the ground. It's the grain that hits the ground, and when the grain hits the ground, what does it do? Well, maybe it germinates. Maybe there's a new people, maybe there's a new planting in the promised land, or wherever. So
Actually, when I was reading this, I thought about a couple of things. One was, God for all of his vengeance, if you want to think about it from that way, never loses the aspect of his righteousness. So you think about Noah. He destroyed the whole world, but Noah was saved due to his righteousness. I think about when Abraham was talking to him about Sodom and said, what if there's 50? Will you destroy the whole, 45, 20? No, I won't do it if there's 20. And even here, he says, I'm not going to destroy everything. I'll protect those that are righteous to us. So I think about that side of it just to remind me that, if I was God in that, I'd throw the nuclear bomb and blow it all up. But he can exert his judgment and still be righteous to those that are faithful on one hand. And then the other thing that I think about is when you think about how he protected his remnant through all of that in all of the different circumstances. And it's easier for us because we can read the Bible in a few days if we want to and flip back and forth and see how prophets prophesied about something, but it might have been 200 years before it came to fruition, right? And I think about, we've been told Christ is coming back, and we were told Christ is coming back quickly, and we balance out a day as 1,000 years. But what we can know when I read this and see how prophecy was fulfilled is, even though it's been thousands of years, I can still know that it's coming, that day is coming. You know what I mean? Whereas if I were living at the time, I don't know it would have been as easy as it is for us to go back and see, oh yeah, I read back in this Jeremiah where he prophesied about this and it was fulfilled 200 years later or what have you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a good point. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because as we read on here, we're about to get to the one one of the few, maybe the only one, the only direct quotation from Amos in the New Testament. And it's interesting. So we'll continue to talk kind of about that as we cover these verses. Verse 11, in that day, I'll restore David's fallen shelter. I'll repair its broken walls and restore its ruins and will repair it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. Back in chapter 8, you had in that day, the young people from Israel will faint from thirst. You have a reversal here. This is what I was talking about. Things look better at the end of Amos. There is a reversal. In that day when there's going to be judgment, there's going to be this sorrow, there's going to be this pain. But in that day, there's also going to be something else happen. And this gets really interesting. What do you notice about verse 11? In that day, I'll restore David's fallen shelter. Did anything jump out at you about that?
I was thinking of the temple, but David didn't build the temple.
David had the intention of building the temple.
Right.
Well, what's strange about mentioning David here? Who's Amos prophesying to? The
It's the
north.
lineage, right?
He's prophesying to the north. So it's really striking that here, when things are, looking up, what he mentions is David's fallen tent. And there's a lot of theories about what exactly is Amos getting at. Does he mean a united kingdom, a reunited north and south, the way it was under David, and that sort of idealized time in their history? Is he talking about a rebuilt temple? Because that word tent often has to do with the tabernacle or some sort of worship structure. It's a really interesting statement that Amos makes here. Why does he bring up David at this point? And I think it has to do with the fact that it's in this lineage of David, in this promise to David, that Amos thinks there is hope for that God wants Amos to say that there is hope for his people. It's in this Davidic dynasty that the North has pulled away from, right? They've rejected. When David's grandson Rehoboam became king, that's when the split happened, and so they've walked away from that dynasty, but Amos says God is still working on that dynasty. He'll repair its broken walls, restore its ruins, will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. What nations bear his name?
Would Judah be one of them?
Yeah. But that's about it, right? So this is the place, and a lot of prophets do this, where there's a picture of some future where God will have people in all the nations, not just in Israel, where there'll be this, the law will go out from Jerusalem. Is that Isaiah? I can't remember. The picture of God bringing people from all over into his covenant, bringing nations from all over into his covenant. Turn to Acts 15. Now, Acts 15 is this meeting in Jerusalem. They all have to go to the home office because there's some questions about all these renegades who are out preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, and we just got to figure out how we're going to handle this stuff with the Gentiles. This isn't what we were expecting was going to happen. Verse 12, the whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. When they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it's written. After this, I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I'll rebuild and I'll restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does things known long ago. What James says is what Amos was speaking of, that's what we're seeing happen. And so basically what James says is the experience that Saul and Barnabas and these others, Peter, who are preaching to the Gentiles, the experiences that they're having line up with what Scripture says. And so we're going to roll with it. Now, he quotes Amos from probably the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So there's a couple of differences. One of the differences is instead of possessing the land of Edom, you have the rest of mankind may seek the Lord. And I'm not a Hebrew guy, but I'm told that there are a couple of revocalizations that you do that get you that result, the Septuagint result. So that's probably where that came from. But it's really interesting that James is seeing, what James is seeing is that specifically in the coming of Gentiles into the church, God is fulfilling somehow this promise to rebuild David's fallen tent and bring about and bring into choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. And I think it's really interesting example of how the early church sort of looked at what was going on with the gospel and looked at what's happening as they preached the gospel in these places that wouldn't have necessarily expected at the beginning, and how they saw Scripture, saw the prophets being fulfilled in these things. So I just think it's a really kind of neat way of seeing this connection talked about, Steve, that this fulfillment of prophecy in a way that nobody would have expected, nobody would have thought of, and seeing the significance of what's happening through the gospel all over the world as having these connections back to Amos. Thoughts about that, or questions, or comments? We could go on about that for a long time, but I don't think it's necessary. I think you see the point there. I think you see the connection.
I have a question. I've been holding on to something you said earlier, Patrick. I don't mean to move away from what you just read, but you made a comment about there's a difference between being called by God versus privileged by God. I don't know if you remember, you said that early on.
Yeah, I said called and loved by God. The difference between being called and loved by God versus being privileged over others. I think that's what I said.
Okay. Can you say more about that? That's all I was asking.
Well, just the statement in Amos, you're just like the Cushites, you're just like the Arameans, you're just like what was the other one? The Philistines. I brought them from another place to where they are now, just like I brought you from Egypt to the promised land. You're not any different than they are. And of course they're different in the fact that they have this covenant. But I think the point is that as they have violated this covenant, as they've walked away from God, they aren't to think that their status as God's people will let them escape the judgment that's coming. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easy to see God's call and God's love as a source of, for lack of a better word, of privilege over others. You know, we're special and they're not. We're better than they are. We are exempt from God's judgment. We are people who experience His grace. We, you know, and all of them are the ones who are out in the cold. You know, all of them are the ones who will have to experience His judgment. And I think Amos is pushing back against that. Remember earlier in the book, woe to you, say, you know, let the day of the Lord come. You know, you're going to find it's not what you thought it was. You're going to find that it's not nearly as good for you as you might have thought. When the day of the Lord comes, it's going to come with judgment. It's going to be like you were chased into your house and you put your hand on the wall to relax because you think you're safe and a snake bites you. You know, you're going to find it's not the peace that you are hoping for.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No problem. So anyway, I think interesting, and near the end here we have this prophecy that the early church saw themselves in, saw their experience in. This is what's happening. This David's fallen tent is being rebuilt and resurrected, literally, right? A fallen tent resurrected in Jesus, and this hope, this promise of a nation of nations that bear God's name. By the way, the word nations, the word we translate nations, and the word we translate Gentiles, it's the same word usually. That's the way the Israelites referred to. There were themselves, and there were the nations, right? The Gentiles, all of those other people. So the difference in between nations in Amos and Gentiles in Acts is really negligible. So, verse 13 then, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman. What does that mean? The planter by the one treading grapes. Most of us aren't agricultural people, but what is it getting at? The reaper will be overtaken by the plowman.
Maybe like an abundance.
Yeah, abundance, right? Yeah. Who's the?
Well, it's like they'll have two crops
Yeah.
a year.
Yeah. So the reaper's harvesting. Well, the reaper's harvesting. The guy's coming up behind him because he's got to plow the next furrow. The next furrows. You're not going to have any time in between when the land isn't produced. It's going to be this constant agricultural cycle going on. It's a picture of abundance. The planter by the one treading the grapes. The guy's planting the grapes, and there's already the one coming behind him to harvest them and tread out the wine from the grapes. It's abundant. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I'll bring my people Israel back from exile. They'll rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They'll plant vineyards and drink their wine. They'll make gardens and eat their fruit. I'll plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given, says the Lord your God. And the end is Lord your God. I think that's intentional, right? This is Amos reminding the people by the judgment that's coming, despite what's going to happen. There's hope. There's promise. There's prosperity. New wine, not prosperity. When you see that in the Old Testament, when you have new wine flowing off the mountains, that means everything is going well. There's plenty of crops. There's plenty of abundance, and that's the picture at the end of Amos.
It's saying that to restore its formal glory.
Yes, right. It will, yeah, right. Yeah. He's going to restore Israel's former. Now, when did that happen for the northern kingdom? Well, it didn't. As far as we know, it didn't, right? As far as we know, there was not a return for the 10 tribes of the. There was a return for the southern kingdom, but it wasn't exactly this prosperity either. And interestingly, by Jesus' day, you have a lot of the religious leaders of the Jews talking about how they've never returned from exile. You know, they've never come out of exile. They're in their land, but they're still in exile because, you know, they've gone from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans. There's only been a small segment of time in there where they were independent at all. The prosperity hasn't come. The return of David's descendant hasn't come, and so there's a feeling that they're still in exile, and that lends even more force, I think, to James's use of this book to say what God is doing, with the Gentiles is a fulfillment, or at least in some way a connection to this prophecy, this hope that we have. And these are the kinds of reasons why Jesus as the Messiah was an important concept. Even in the early church, the church was going into non-Jewish territory where Messiah didn't have the kind of meaning. But the idea that Jesus was bringing the fulfillment of God's promises, and that even those who weren't Jews could be connected to that through Jesus, through faith and trust in Him. All right, comments, questions, thoughts? How about that? We're through Amos. How about that? We're through Amos. Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting.
Well, it's one of those books that we sometimes we sometimes don't really spend much time with it for obvious reasons. I mean, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to go through a long study of Amos, but thanks for being there and sticking with it, and I hope you gain something from it, and if nothing else, you gain maybe a little more familiarity with Amos. But anyway.
Can't we just go to the next chapter?
You mean Obadiah?
Yes.
Yeah, what's that word anyway?